Hello and welcome to the third seminar on NATO and the future of the Transatlantic Alliance in my seminar series entitled Building Policy Consensus on the World Stage, the Pitfalls, Progress, and Possibilities. Last time we talked about the increasing number of multifaceted and interrelated challenges and geopolitical shifts in an increasingly complicated international environment that is changing at an ever-increasing speed. We discuss with these shifts and the shifting realities and new security threats, the range of new actors and the speed of development of new communication technologies and platforms, need for diplomacy, both bilateral and multilateral, in terms of its relevance and adapting to the new environment. We focus on the fitness of the current UN system and other multilateral organizations to solve global issues such as climate change, migration, terrorism, inequality, sustainable development, and public health that have been further compounded and exacerbated by the rapid development of both connected and disruptive technologies, artificial intelligence, new types of warfare, and most recently, the COVID-19 pandemic. Today, we will focus on the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, or the Transatlantic Alliance as we often refer to it. Adaptation has been one of the primary characteristics of the alliance, and it has been the most successful political military alliance in the world. However, adaptation is also one of the primary prerequisites or preconditions for its survival and continued relevance. And this is the gist of what we will be discussing today. My main point being the reemergence of some traditional threats and the new and still emerging threats and challenges continue to testify to the need and continued relevance of the NATO alliance. However, we need an alliance that is constantly adapting to the changing security environment. We need a modernized and transformed alliance, an alliance fit for purpose with increased cooperation, solidarity, and mutual understanding among allies, in particular across the Atlantic. And of course, with solidarity and mutual understanding with partners outside of the alliance, in order to tackle asymmetric and hybrid threats and challenges that come from the outside and that come from within the alliance, to tackle the shifting geopolitical realities, the new types of warfare, and other challenges. And last but not least, we need to seize on the opportunities for cooperation. And there are many in spite of the challenges. I am honored and privileged to be joined today by NATO Secretary General Jaap Scheffer, who served from 2004 to 2009, for whom I have greatest respect and whom I consider not just a longtime colleague, but a friend as well. Secretary Scheffer will share his views on keeping the relevance and readiness of NATO in light of the reemergence of territorial threats, but also of the growing threats and challenges posed by disruptive technologies and communications revolution, as well as internal disagreements that can be corrosive to the alliance. I have worked at and with NATO in various capacities. As Croatian foreign minister, when I argued the case for Croatia's NATO membership before the North Atlantic Council, and visited our mission in Afghanistan for the first time, then as Croatia's ambassador to the US, and then as NATO Assistant Secretary General for Public Diplomacy, and finally as President of Croatia. But it was during my time as a member of NATO's senior leadership and head of public diplomacy division that I had to argue most about the relevance and transformation of NATO. I loved my job at NATO, by the way, and the collaborative work experience and atmosphere. And in particular, I found spending time on the ground in the theater of operations in Afghanistan most useful, where I dealt not just with ISAF-related issues, but also with many other issues such as the right of education, general gender equality and empowerment of women, and working on all of these aspects really gave me a sense of purpose, and I felt like I was making a difference in people's lives. And I truly do hope that we preserve those gains. I arrived to NATO on July 4th, 2011. NATO was in the midst of its operation in Libya. The so-called new strategic concept had just been adopted at the Lisbon summit in 2010. It defined the three pillars of NATO: collective defense, crisis management, and cooperative security. To put the long story short, collective defense is the backbone of the alliance, the protection of the territory, population, and assets of the alliance, with particular emphasis on Article 4, calling for consultations, and Article 5, to put it briefly, an attack on one is an attackable, really is the gist of what NATO does. Secondly, crisis management basically reflected to NATO's operations at the time. And it will be very interesting to see with Secretary General Jaap Scheffer how this crisis management element will reflect in the future, especially in terms of strategic thinking rather than ad hoc management of crisis. And of course, cooperative security, to put it simply, it's all about partnerships around the world, from partnership to for peace to many other partnerships. It's very important to note that NATO is not just a military alliance, it's a political alliance, as well as an alliance of values. There is a shared democratic identity at NATO, and it helped all of us who strive to become members of NATO after the fall of the Berlin Wall with our own democratization processes at home. Unfortunately, people had long forgotten what war and divisions looked like in Europe when I worked at NATO. Most of Europe had been spared from a war for decades, fortunately. So many started taking the alliance for granted, and many started taking peace for granted. But for some of us, memories of war and divisions across Europe were fresh. It was the time when NATO was nourishing its partnerships, including with Russia as a member of Partnership for Peace, and then the relations with Russia started to deteriorate rapidly. The US-Europe or EU members' relationship was one of the most prominent topics, and it was always about the asymmetrical contribution and the asymmetrical expectations, with the US providing most of the capabilities. And at the time, many accused Europe of being just the free riders and taking advantage of the US capabilities, and of everyone actually arguing for more of of an EU contribution. However, it was also the time of the US pivot to Asia during the Obama administration and the resounding fear of the US abandoning Europe. The Libya operation at the point when I arrived was at sort of a stalemate, not going that well, but it was concluded successfully, and the UN concluded it was carried out within the UN Security Council resolutions mandate. At the time, I got a lot of questions. Why intervention in Libya and not later in Syria? What about the responsibility to protect? In Afghanistan, we were transitioning from the ISAF mission to the Resolute Support mission, which was perceived by the local population whom I met during my many visits as sort of a precipice that they were fearing they would fall off and that they would not be protected. There were more and more questions about the relevance of NATO and whether it was just a relic of the Cold War. So NATO itself had been changing. In my presentations, I would outline several phases in the history of NATO. First, the Cold War, or the static NATO, when NATO was a deterrent, keeping the balance between the powers. Then, secondly, the post-Cold War NATO, a brief soul-searching phase when we were talking about the end of history and the victory of the liberal world order before the new transborder threats started to emerge. Then the third phase, NATO as a unifying force, bridging the divides and bringing about the ideal of Europe whole, free, and at peace. Enlargement as, in my opinion, one of the most successful policies of NATO, raising the remnants of the Iron Curtain. Then another phase was an active NATO, with out-of-area operations, beginning in Bosnia and Herzegovina and Kosovo, that were a little bit more contentious in the international public, with Kosovo being designated as something that was done with legitimacy, but without the legal aspect of UN Security Council provisions. And then we had operations in Afghanistan, the Horn of Africa, Libya, and elsewhere. So the question is, what kind of NATO do we need now? What kind of alliance do we need that has to adapt to the resurgence of the territorial threats and a new external security environment that has changed dramatically since the 2010 new strategic concept? The last strategic concept that was adapted by NATO, and that in the course of my service of NATO is stopped calling new. So we will discuss today the main characteristics of the current security environment, the principal threats and challenges that NATO faces. And I'm glad to know that at the NATO summit in London in December 2019, alliance leaders asked the NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg to undertake a forward-looking reflection process to assess ways to strengthen the political dimension of NATO. The reflection group that he put together has produced a report, and we're waiting for recommendations and to see what happens in the year 2021 with respect to the future of NATO. So today we will focus on the issues of importance for the future of the transatlantic relationship. We will first look at the shifting geopolitical realities and at external and internal challenges. In the context of internal challenges and opportunities, we will in particular discuss how the past 4 or 5 years of US foreign policy, the asymmetry of capabilities and the asymmetry of expectations, and Europe's own attempts at strategic autonomy have affected the transatlantic relationship. Finally, I hope that we will provide an insight into what needs to happen next to restore the trust between the US and its allies, and how to make the alliance adapt and adopt to the challenges and fit for purpose. So let me welcome our distinguished guest. After having served in the Royal Netherlands Air Force, Professor Emeritus and former Secretary General of NATO, Jaap Scheffer began his professional career in the Foreign Service of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs in 1976, serving in Ghana, then at the Netherlands delegation to NATO, and as a private secretary to the Dutch foreign minister. In 1986, he was elected to the House of Representatives of the State Journal for the Christian Democratic Party, CDA, and served on the Standing Committee on Foreign Affairs, Justice, European Affairs, and Defense, as well as the chair of the Standing Committee for Foreign Affairs and Development Cooperation, and a member of the Parliamentary Assemblies of NATO and the Council of Europe. He was the party leader of the CDA between 1997 and 2001, and on 22nd July 2002, he was appointed Minister of Foreign Affairs, during which time he also served as chairman in office of the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe on behalf of Netherlands in 2003. From January 2004 to August 2009, he was Secretary General of NATO and Chairman of the North Atlantic Council. Since then, he has served on a number of for-profit and non-for-profit organizations and institutions, lectured in The Hague at the Faculty of Governance and Global Affairs of his alma mater, Leiden University, on international relations and the practice of diplomacy. He is the chair of the Advisory Council on International Affairs for both government and parliament, and a member of the Advisory Council of the Dutch Employers Organization. He's the chair of the Netherlands Civil Honors Advisory Committee, and in 2018 was appointed Minister of State. I'm so excited to have Jaap as our guest tonight. Jaap and I first met and worked together when I was Minister of Foreign Affairs of Croatia, and would report in the fulfillment of the annual membership action plan cycles to the NAC, the North Atlantic Council. When I was Croatia's ambassador to the US, we attended the memorable White House ceremony when President George W. Bush signed the protocol of accession to NATO for Croatia and Albania. Jaap provided much assistance and advice during Croatia's accession to NATO, and we have been colleagues and friends ever since. Today, we serve together on the board of trustees of the Friends of Europe, Brussels-based independent think tank. Jaap, good evening to you and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us tonight, although it's quite late in the evening in Europe and at the end of a long holiday weekend. Good evening.
Good evening, Madam President. Good evening, Kolinda, and thank you so much for the invitation of being with you this hour. It's a great honor and it's a great pleasure.
Absolutely, and it is a great honor and pleasure that you have accepted the invitation. So first of all, we would like to hear about your own assessment of the state of alliance today and how you would compare the current circumstances to the time when you were Secretary General of NATO. What are the main vulnerabilities, the greater challenges, and the threats of the alliance today, and what is the state of alliance today?
Well, thank you so much, Kolinda. You've covered a lot of ground in your excellent introductory speech. Let me start by saying that we should realize, discussing the transatlantic relationship and the alliance more in particular, that as we speak, Europe is not a first priority for the United States of America. China is. We should realize that, and that at the same time is a message for all of us on the European side of the Atlantic that we have to invest in the relationship because it goes without saying that for the coming period, for the coming decades, I dare say, the rivalry between the United States of America and superpower China will be the dominant geopolitical factor we will discuss in the world. Having said that, it is clear that over the past 4 years, the United States of America, and that reflects on the North Atlantic Alliance as well, I would phrase it, has lost soft power, has lost leadership. Let me give you as an example a recent opinion poll by the European Council on Foreign Relations. The result was that people are very happy with the Biden administration, so am I, but there also was a lot of skepticism about the global leadership of the United States of America, more specifically in Germany and less in France, which is interesting, but it's too wide-ranging now to dwell on that for too long. So Joe Biden, whom I met several times when he was vice president, is an old hand in international relations, is an old NATO hand, knows NATO very well, knows how it functions, knows how it works, also knows that NATO can adapt. And as you said, Kolinda, NATO will have to adapt. And my primary remark and point would be, you mentioned it indirectly, NATO is a political military alliance in that order, not a military alliance. It would never survive as just a military alliance. It's a political military alliance, and NATO's political dimension should be strengthened. Not to be too long, what does that mean? That means, first of all, that the NAC, the North Atlantic Council, should every week when it meets have an agenda item, statements on political subjects. You mentioned my time as a young second secretary in the Cold War when I was serving at NATO. This was every week an agenda item. When I was Secretary General, and you realize because you came a bit later to NATO, it was very difficult to raise a political topic outside the normal NATO domain, outside Afghanistan, outside Kosovo. Let's discuss China, impossible politically. So as the reflection group you mentioned also indicated, a more political dimension of NATO to me means, for instance, that NATO develops a China policy. That NATO maps out what does superpower China means on every element relevant to the security of NATO allies, from the classical threats to cyber, to artificial intelligence, to biotechnology, to space, and what have you. Second point, that NATO develops, and you know as I do how difficult that is, Kolinda, that NATO develops a coherent and consistent Russia policy. The NATO-Russia relations are at an all-time low, I don't hesitate to mention. But we also know that it's awfully difficult to come to a consistent NATO policy. And the fact that the High Representative for Foreign Affairs of the European Union was humiliated by Sergei Lavrov in Russia not long ago, you will say that's the European Union, not NATO, is a consequence of the fact that also in the European Union there is no consistent Russia policy. So as the reflection group mentioned, a more political NATO. And I know that Jens Stoltenberg is in full agreement. It's easier said than done, by the way, a more political NATO. Second point, you mentioned it as well, Kolinda, collective defense should be front and center, be it conventional, be it hybrid, be it, a more difficult topic always, be it nuclear. NATO still is an alliance where nuclear deterrence plays an important role and should play an important role. So less attractive topic, certainly in society, but we have to. So a more political NATO, a NATO which pays attention to its core relevance, and that is deter aggression. Yeah, and point number 3, in NATO, which lives up to its obligations. You mentioned the 2%, you mentioned Wales. I'm not yet ready to forget about the principle of the 2%, because I know that my country, which is doing very badly, the Netherlands, with a number of other nations who are not living up to expectations, when you say, okay, the 2% in fact is too rigid, those nations and those politicians will lose the incentive to at all discuss how we are going to reach the 2%. Final remark, not to be too long. I started and I'll end with the fact that the Atlantic relationship, important as it is not the first priority. Let me also mention that the transatlantic relationship and the health of the transatlantic relationship, and that goes slightly beyond NATO, is also defined on answering the question, how can we cooperate on climate change? What will be the trade relationship between the United States of America and Europe, and of course, the security element. Entirely finally, the United States of America should always, now speaking as a European, should always be and remain our first point of reference. NATO is an alliance of values. We share values with the United States of America, and there can never be any point and I see that in Europe and I feel it in Europe, that there will be a sort of equidistance from Europe to the United States on the one hand and China on the other hand. Equidistance is dangerous. China will never be our first point of reference. Russia certainly will never be our first point of reference. So that is why I am an Atlanticist, although I am also very much a European, but no equidistance. And in the relationship with China, and then I'll finish with this sentence, there is a very important ideological component. We're dealing with a society and a civilization here which is completely alien to ours. And that brings a number of questions also in the NATO realm, in the NATO domain, which are very difficult, but which we'll have to answer. Thank you, Kolinda. as my first answer.
Thank you. Thank you, Jaap, for these introductory remarks. And I would like to touch upon a little bit more in detail of each and every one of them when we talk about more of about the transatlantic relationship, the opinion and the divergent views, and unfortunately the stumbling blocks that we have seen in the past 4 or 5 years across the Atlantic. But before we go to these specific elements and specific aspects, and you mentioned China, you mentioned Russia, I would add to that also the energy component, the energy distribution, economic recession and crisis that we're facing, of course, the rapid technological development that affects the nature of warfare, the new communications environment, and the disruptors that we have seen. So when it comes to disruptors, the big question now is, what do you think the effects of COVID-19 pandemic will be on the alliance? Has it, and if it has, how has it complicated or exacerbated the threats, and what effects do you think it has had and will have on the state of alliance? And we're looking not just the defense budget, but we're looking at the overall closing in of societies. We've seen the rise of nationalism, populism, of even COVID nationalism. We've seen that societies are trying to protect themselves in isolation, whereas we know that these transborder threats cannot be fought by single states in isolation. So what do you think the effect of COVID-19 will be on the overall state of the alliance?
Well, first of all, as you clearly indicate, COVID-19 is geopolitics, and COVID-19 has very much entered the geopolitical domain. Look at China's policy on vaccines. Look at Russia's Sputnik policy on vaccines. COVID-19 has resulted in playing the geopolitical card in this respect. Secondly, COVID has resulted in the fact that we are now conversing online, that we can not meet in person anymore, and that in all nations, also in NATO nations, has led to the formal closing of borders, has led to a completely different type of diplomacy, because on-screen diplomacy is incomparable with diplomacy as you and I know it very well, around a NATO table, physical contact, physical presence, being able to see who's talking to whom, reading the body language. So a completely different kinds of democracy. Nationalism has been fanned by COVID-19, as you said, because understandably, vaccination is own citizens first. And I can add, and that's also a geopolitical remark, unless we have vaccinated in Kenya and Botswana and Outer Mongolia as well, we can vaccinate in Croatia and the Netherlands, in the US and in the United Kingdom. But if there is a mutated virus originating in Kenya or Tanzania where people have not been vaccinated, I mean, we can restart. So
we're not protected any longer.
We're not. So the lack of solidarity I'm seeing, and I think we should really, and then we are not in the NATO domain, but in other domains, we should really see that we can make it financially possibly that those vaccines will be produced in those nations themselves as well, so that they can vaccinate, financial problems and what have you. Coming back to the alliance, I hope and I know that NATO is strong enough, as it has adapted over the decades, to survive a COVID crisis. But COVID has exacerbated new threats and challenges. And you mentioned populism, which goes from denying the COVID-19 crisis to anti-vax, to troubles for governments in convincing their population that they should, one, adhere to the measures imposed, heavy measures like curfews and what have you. I see it in my own country. You see it in your own country, Kolinda. So COVID-19 is geopolitics. And I'm very happy that at least in the United States of America, President Biden seems to be rather successful in fighting COVID, and in starting even, as I read in the international press, starting even, and that will increase the lost soft power I was talking about of the United States of America, increase the soft power, and by that way increase US leadership across the globe. I mean, in that respect, we can turn the COVID-19 crisis into an advantage by re-establishing United States leadership. Kolinda, the world doesn't organize itself. And the United States of America has always been the prime organizer, for better and for worse, I will say. And that is a situation which I would like to continue. I repeat, the US are our first point of reference, not China, not Russia, not any other nation.
Absolutely. And now moving really on the US-European relationship, and the fact that, we in Europe really are looking towards the US as the force that we will continue to lead European defense. And quite honestly, I myself look at the United States as a European power, even though it's not physically located in Europe. So the past 4 or 5 years, I have witnessed situations that were very corrosive to this relationship and the alliance, where of course there are disagreements that you can, I won't say blame, but that they're due to diverse positions on both sides of the Atlantic. And I would like to focus a little bit on those, from multilateralism in general to trade relations to Iran, JCPOA and nuclear issues in general, to Russia and different opinion about China on both sides of the Atlantic. How we can look at those and how we can reconcile those for the purpose of the unity and solidarity across the Atlantic. And this, as we have both concluded, world that with shifting geopolitical power, where geopolitics and this spheres of influence concept that has gone well beyond traditional domain of spheres of influence, and the whole globalized world has become one big sphere of influence where the powers are competing for predominance, whether it be by military defense, economic, which is, I think, not in the domain of soft power any longer, but has become an element of hard power. And then we have the soft power and the smart power. So how can we be smart about it across the Atlantic? How to use both the hard and the soft power? First, I would like to start with Russia, because we have focused on Russia in terms of the reemergence of territorial threats, the deteriorating relationship between NATO and Russia. But what about the Russian perception of threats? What about the enlargement of NATO? How do you see it as Secretary General, during whose time enlargement happened, and there were discussions about further enlargement, how Russia perceives it? And having in mind, the interest of peace across the continent and across the world, what can be done about it in order to see a constructive dialogue going forward, but also balancing with the desire and the wish of each and every single country or nation to choose their own future and choose the alliances where they will belong. And in addition to that, again, I said we focused on the northeast of Europe and the east of Europe, Ukraine, Crimea, etc. But what about my own neighborhood, southeast of Europe? What about the so-called Western Balkans? Fortunately, I see the expansion of NATO in recent years. Both Montenegro and North Macedonia have become members of NATO. But we see the EU process stalling. And from the direct experience that I have in the region is that if you create a vacuum where people are being told, look, you want to become members of NATO and the EU, and they don't want you, no matter what you do, no matter how good you are, it creates a vacuum that is filled by third forces that are not necessarily benevolent to the region. and that are not necessarily well-meaning. So how do you see these out-of-area threats affecting not just the East, but the Southeast and the South of Europe?
Let me start with the basic remark, and then I'll move to the Balkans, Kolinda. The basic question Joe Biden will ask us Europeans is the following: dear friends in Europe, we are in a partnership. How do you define your weight in our partnership? It's a key question for NATO. How do you define your weight? Not only the 2%, not only militarily, but also politically. That's a key question for us Europeans to answer. We have to answer that question inside the North Atlantic Alliance. We have to answer that question, you mentioned it, in the European Union as well. When I travel through your region, Kolinda, I see Russian influence. I see the Chinese being very active. I see Turkey being very active. I even saw Saudi Arabia very much interested in Europe's backyard. And you're absolutely right. Like in nature sciences, a vacuum will always be filled. If there is a vacuum, it will be filled. The problem is, and my ideal still is, as I had it, and I will have it, that Euro-Atlantic integration is key for that part of Europe, because it is a part of Europe. But you now have, thank heavens, we have Croatia in, we have now Montenegro, North Macedonia. Serbia is of course sitting on the fence, but in Serbia you see a lot of Russian influence as well. What is the problem of Euro-Atlantic integration? And I mentioned specifically Euro and Atlantic, because European Union integration is, I think, at the end of the day, even more complicated than NATO integration, because it is simply a wider ranging process. I'm not going to say NATO is easy to enter, as you know by your own experience. But if you see developments in Albania at the moment, to give you just one example, where the European Union is pushing Albania away, it's a good example. Give them a perspective. Give them a perspective for the European Union, as we gave them perspective in your time and in my time, together with Croatia, by the way, of EU and NATO membership. Why pushing? Not everything is okay in Croatia. So on the Balkans, very much in agreement. What we also should resist, by the way, when we talk about the Balkans, are fora like the Chinese have set up, the 17+1 or the 18+1. The Chinese very much like to have bilateral relations with the members of NATO or the members of the European Union, because Xi Jinping doesn't like multilateral institutions like NATO and the EU, but let me focus on the EU. He should go to Brussels and talk to Brussels and not to individual nations in the Western Balkans or wherever. On Russia and Ukraine and Georgia, I must be self-critical here. I think that the Bucharest summit in 2008 had the wrong result when we saw the big political battle between George W. Bush on the one hand and Merkel and Sarkozy, the then French president, on the other hand. And the communique read, they will become NATO members, Ukraine and Georgia, as you will remember. Mm-hmm. Putin, then already Putin, of course, painted two big red lines after that summit. That was a red line on Georgia and a red line on Ukraine. He thought NATO crossed those red lines. What did he do? He invaded Georgia in August 2008. And I can draw a straight line to what he is doing in Donetsk and Luhansk and what he did in 2014 in annexing Crimea. So that was a critical decision by NATO. And in retrospect, my opinion is that perhaps we should have gone a bit more slowly than immediately write down in a communique they will become NATO members. I can be right, I can be wrong. Joe Biden will be much more critical on Russia than his predecessor. Joe Biden will be much more forward-leaning on Ukraine than his predecessor. And again, coming back to my key question, Joe Biden will ask us, what is your weight in this partnership, dear friends? Are you with me or are you not with me? If I want to go one step further vis-a-vis Ukraine, to go out of area, when I want to go one step further vis-a-vis China, are you with me or are you not with me? So not necessarily the US interests and the European interests will run parallel. We have to be prepared for that. On digital taxation, on trade, on climate, not necessarily everywhere parallelism. But that does not mean that we should not invest heavily in that relationship. So in brief, in the Western Balkans, fully in agreement with your remarks and analysis, which means investing. The problem with that investment, Kolinda, is not again relevant to NATO, but to the European Union, that there is major hesitance in national parliaments, including mine here in the Netherlands, to further enlarge the European Union. It will be very, very, very tough. People think that Romania and Bulgaria were admitted too early. I mean, you know the stories. But still, we have to push, and we have to continue pushing, in my opinion. But that is an opinion which, in my country and in other countries, is not widely shared.
Yes, I'm unfortunately well aware of that, because I have been pushing and I have been a huge proponent of enlargement of NATO and the European Union. I think it's just, it brings us all to the same table after all, and it allows us a platform to deal with open issues before they flare up and become problems, and an integrated space of freedom, democracy, security, and the same values, along with economic and security benefits, is always most welcome. We've seen too much war, division, and bloodshed, and difficulties in Europe. Now, you've mentioned China, and this is a topic that I guess we would talk for a long while. You've mentioned the initiative 17+1, but then there is the One Belt, One Road. And I think it's China's policy of using the soft power, but also the attraction of investment in order to exert their own influence. There was a question by one of the students that was sent in, Manish Mali, who asked about how NATO countries, and especially Croatia, will be influenced by US and China in terms of competition, confrontation, and cooperation. Now, China is a very interesting issue, because on the one hand, you have Central and Eastern Europe. I prefer to call the area Central Europe, but of course, I do accept that it is called Central and Eastern Europe, and the Western Balkans or whatever, singled out as being the target or very recipient to Chinese influence. Whereas when you look at the hard data with respect to trade and investment, it's actually Northern Europe. In 2019, for instance, Finland was the biggest recipient of Chinese investment. And in the past years, it has been the UK and Germany, the countries in the north in general. And the level of Chinese investment in Central and Eastern Europe has, I think, been below, at least it was in 2019, below 10%. In Croatia specifically, it was about 0.4%. And a lot of people think that the bridge that is being built to the Pelješac bridge to connect the two parts of Croatia is financed by the Chinese, but it's not. It's actually financed by the European Union and the Croatian government, and the Chinese have won the public bid in terms of being the cheapest bid, because that's how the bidding process in the European Union works. So there is susceptibility to influence. However, you look at, for instance, the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment that was concluded in December of 2020. From which I believe Germany, France, and the UK, who's no longer a member of the European Union, but is still in Europe, will benefit most. So why is it that Uh, Central and Eastern Europe is being singled out as so susceptible to Chinese influence. And how can we actually reconcile these views from the European Union and the United States when it comes to China? I'm currently in Washington, D.C., but even before that, I've been following what's going on. And I see that China is being singled out as the problem number one for the U.S., not just foreign policy, but the think tank community, etc. And the United States, overall, I'm not just talking about the Biden administration, but everybody here feels that Europe is not doing enough. How do you see the future of that relationship? How can we reconcile it? How can we be productive in that, in managing the competition, confrontation, and cooperation issues to bring that towards more cooperation and working through the EU-China Comprehensive Agreement on Investment, or the 5G toolkit that the European Union has in order to deal with the intellectual property issues with investment and trade issues, tariffs, trade, etc., that would benefit both sides of the alliance and everybody actually when it comes to regulated trade and investment and security relations.
Well, to start with the comprehensive agreement on investment, I have my strong doubts if that will pass the European Parliament, given the present state of affairs between the European Union and China, Uyghurs, Hong Kong, what have you. Secondly, it might well be, and I hear in this country and around me talk about this, that the national parliaments will say, hey, listen, guys in Brussels, this is not exclusive Commission competence. It should be a mixed agreement. So national parliaments should have their say about this agreement as well. I must admit that it was rushed through at the 30th of December during the last days of the German presidency. German foreign policy has always had a very strong industrial element. I mean, motor cars is just one example. The presentation was strange. It was not Chancellor Merkel and Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel, but Macron suddenly appeared on a television screen. France had never been a great proponent of this agreement. Anyway, that's all fine. Your analysis, of course, about Central Europe is on the mark. And I think people like you and other Central European politicians should push back in this regard. My opinion is, first of all, that you cannot ring fence 1.4 billion Chinese. So decoupling and only confrontation can never be, in my opinion, the answer in that relationship. That's point number one. Point number two is that we as Europeans need more self-confidence. We are a huge market. We are a regulatory giant. The Amazons, the Facebooks, the Googles and the Microsofts, they have to follow what competition commissioners allow and do not allow in Brussels, or face millions and millions of fines. So we are a regulatory giant in Europe, and we should have our own position in that rivalry between those two superpowers, and not end in a nutcracker because we have to choose either the one or the other. No equidistance, I repeat. When we face a choice, my choice is the United States of America and not China, but we need an independent position. Be it on trade, be it on the modern technologies. You mentioned Huawei, Nokia, Ericsson. Why are we in the position vis-a-vis Huawei? Because the European Union has totally forgotten about investment in its own technology over the past 10, 15 years. I mean, why is it that we are surpassed by the US and by China on all these elements? Why are we not in the lead in Europe? Now speaking as a convinced European, why is that? So self-confidence, in my opinion, is key. At the same time, I realize, and I come back to the Americans and to my key question: what is your weight in our partnership? The question by Joe Biden to all of us in Europe. can we simply say that China's assertiveness or aggressiveness in the South and East China Seas, in the Gulf of Bengal or wherever, that freedom of navigation, is that an exclusive task? We would say that's up to you, Joe Biden. That is only America. Coming back to an earlier remark, I'm not advocating that NATO is going to sail with big flotillas in the South and East China Sea. But what I'm advocating is that NATO also defines that China policy and maps out the threats and challenges posed to it by superpower China. Because China, and I repeat, unlike the Cold War, where we were confronting the Soviet Union, which was perverted, but a civilization like ours, perverted, I repeat, Chinese civilization is ancient, is old, but is totally and completely different. And we cannot simply say we are not interested in the Uyghurs in the internment camps or concentration camps. We are not interested in the strangling of Hong Kong. We are not interested in the South and East China Seas and China's false claims on sovereignty. I read The Economist 2 weeks ago. Usually they have their comments, their leaders, with a clear conclusion. When you read The Economist on China, they end, it's an awfully difficult question. I don't have the answers, Kolinda. The answer I have is European self-confidence and mapping out a European position. And if that leads to a lack of parallelism between the European Union and the United States of America, I say, so be it. But let's discuss where it might go, where it might go wrong in this regard. But again, confrontation, decoupling, I think it is not the answer.
Yeah, absolutely agree with you, Jaap. And I would like to use this opportunity to underline something that I pointed out as former president of Croatia to now the former president of the US, Trump, when he complained about especially these aspects and Chinese influences. Well, Mr. President, and I would like to send the same message to the Biden administration. And I'm so happy that they've decided to support the initiative, the 3 Cs initiative that I started with the Polish president, Duda, in order to invest into the infrastructure of Central Europe. I said investment today should be looked at as a strategic aspect. It's an element of geopolitics. If you don't invest, if the US does not invest, if the European does not invest in Central and Eastern Europe, the area is open up for investment from other sides because everybody wants to have a better life and economic development. But time is running. It's been such a wonderful discussion. So time is running fast, and I would like to give an opportunity to my students to ask some questions. But before,
Kolinda, allow me one remark. You're absolutely right. The point is that we in Western Europe, as I was educated in school and at university, we know much too little of the history of Central Europe. That Central Europe has a completely different history. Think about the Habsburg monarchy and so on and so forth. So history education on what makes you tick in Central Europe is also lacking within the European Union. I'm sorry for the interruption, but that's an important element.
No,
it's a lack of understanding.
Exactly, it's an important argument. So just before I move to a European-owned capabilities, the strategic autonomy issues, PESCO, etc. I just we talked about defense spending, or what I prefer to call defense investment, not spending, the 2% of the GDP, out of which 20% should be dedicated to technological development. This is something that we have committed to, all of us, including European member states of NATO, for so many times. And whenever I was asked as president, what do I think about former President Trump's insistence, for instance, on that, I said, well, I completely agree, because this is something that we have agreed to, that we have committed to. Now, of course, all of our countries are at different levels of development and the levels of GDP. And I understand that some small countries who have big GDP cannot devote the 2% because they just have nowhere to spend it. And on the other hand, there's countries such as Croatia and others who are still trying to develop and move from the Eastern to Western technology where we have our own problems. But I've heard recently opinion here in the US that perhaps insistence on the 2% has been counterproductive, that we should have spoken in other terms. On the other hand, I've also heard arguments, especially from the former president, and I think that the current administration will also continue, about Nord Stream 2. And I mentioned energy security and energy diversification in the beginning. That's one of the main pillars of the Three Seas initiative that I have been pushing for the LNG terminal in Kirk, etc., to diversify. So the argument was you're willing to invest billions of euros into something that will rob you of energy independence and energy security, whereas you're not meeting your NATO obligations. What do you think about that, of the validity of that argument, and how we should proceed? You know, the 12 member countries of the EU in Central Europe have actually asked the European Commission to stop the project of Nord Stream 2.
I'll give you a clear and straight answer. I would suspend Nord Stream 2. I would link it to the state of play, which is very bad, as we have concluded, in the relationship between the European Union and Russia. It's part of the answer. I come back again to the Biden question. What is your weight in our partnership, dear friends in Europe? We know what the United States are thinking. We also know that we need diversification of our energy, and I don't blame the Americans for pushing us into buying US LNG, and for that, of course, you need the terminals. I would suspend Nord Stream 2. I also realize that the political reality is such that for Germany, and more specifically for the German Chancellor, whom I admire greatly, by the way, this has always been stated as a strictly economical project, which is nonsense. It is, if there's any project geopolitical, it's this one. And increasing energy dependency on Russia is unfavorable and should be stopped. I should say, let's suspend it. Let's discuss what way we want to go, and let's make it at least a precondition of normalizing relationship with Vladimir Vladimirovich Putin in the Kremlin. And again, this will be an important point for the Biden administration. But I said this already earlier, by the way. I have always been of the opinion that this is geopolitics and it should be stopped. Although, as you and I know, the system of interconnectors we have at the moment will, at least in an emergency, not prevent us from pumping gas to Ukraine or to Central Europe, which those nations which had a huge problem when Putin closed the tap a number of years ago. So my brief answer is, not too brief answer, but is suspend Nord Stream 2 in this regard.
Well, thank you, Jaap, for that. And I'm going to move on to Europe, to Europe's unwillingness to be a junior partner in the relationship with the US and attempts at greater self-reliance and strategic autonomy. The statements that we have heard, for instance, from President Macron, the PESCO, the establishment of the Permanent Structured Cooperation by the Council in December 2017, and other issues, and what effects they will have on the alliance, whether they're beneficial or potentially corrosive. But I want to turn to my student co-producers and give them a chance to ask questions of you. First, Samantha. And then Louis and Samantha has a few questions on the European Defense Force, whether Europe can defend itself and the relationship between Europe and NATO. So Samantha, please.
Hi, first, I'd like to say thank you so much for coming. It's been great hearing you so far. And my first question for you is, should Europe form a European Defense Force? And what do you believe are the challenges and the opportunities for multilateral cooperation and a successful military integration within Europe?
Thank you very much, Samantha. I'm against what is in Europe called the European army. That is a misnomer in my opinion. It will never happen for the simple reason that no national parliament will ever cede power to the European Parliament or any other parliament when it goes about questions of sending your young men and women into harm's way. It will always be national governments and national parliaments deciding on their soldiers being sent abroad. So it's a misnomer. I am very much in favor of the European Union taking more hard power responsibility in the military domain, which is also because, let me phrase it differently, because we cannot, for any crisis on our doorstep, go to the Oval Office, ring the bell and say, Mr. President, could you please help us out? I'll give you one example. We don't have the time to dwell on it for too long. The Sahelian zone, the Sahel in Africa, where terrorism meets migration and migration meets climate change, where you have a very unstable situation where the French at the moment are fighting in Mali, one of those nations, against Islamic extremism. When there would be a major crisis in that area, and some people say that a new Afghanistan is in the making there, can we then go to President Joe Biden and say, could you please help us out? No. So through bilateral cooperation, and Macron has launched a number of ideas in this regard, a strengthening of the bilateral cooperation, not a European army, again a misnomer. Europe should also be able, when the need arises, at a last resort, to project hard power. That is what Europe cannot do. We have NATO for major crises. There we have Article 4, there we have Article 5, there we have the Americans. If Putin decides, which he will not do, to invade the Baltics tomorrow, we have NATO. But the crisis in the Sahelian zone, for instance, or other crises, the European Union, or Europe rather, I should say, because it also concerns non-EU members, should have the opportunity and be willing and ready and able to project hard power. So let's, in the defense realm, in the defense sphere, not talk about strategic autonomy, because it's nonsense. It's a slogan without substance. Europe is not autonomous strategically and militarily, because then the question would immediately come up, oh, does that mean that Europe will have its own nuclear weapon as well, its nuclear deterrence capability? It will not happen in decades or in ages, as you know. So, Samantha, no European army, no independent European defense force, bilateral cooperation, but again, have the courage to project hard power when the need arises.
Samantha, go ahead.
And segueing from the point you touched upon between the role of the United States and the European Union within NATO, is what do you think the role the United States has currently within European defense and with NATO? And what policies would you recommend that the Biden administration should pursue for US and European security? How much should that alliance adapt and modernize to better address new security threats?
Well, first of all, I think the present US administration would be very much in favor of the words I just spoke. Europe taking its own responsibility and also making its own decisions. My idea would be, it's an idea also launched, which I have presented in Brussels, to have a European Security Council, European Security Council, I'm not saying an EU Security Council, European Security Council, where you have 3 permanent members, the United Kingdom, which we need after Brexit, because European defense without the UK is only France, because Germany will, for reasons we all understand, never be in the forefront. European Security Council as an informal body, where you have as permanent members the United Kingdom, France and Germany, the President of the European Union Council and the Secretary General of NATO. Those guys and girls come together whenever a crisis arises, and they are in an informal debate going to decide who is going to do what. That is not a formal institution, but an informal institution. I'm personally very much in favor, and that would certainly be supported by the United States of America, as long as the NATO SecGen is involved. And through him or her, I hope her at a certain moment, is the link to NATO, and you need a link to NATO in Europe. we might have a very capable NATO Secretary General in our midst at the moment, and you know who I mean. In other words, this will be the certainly supported by the Biden administration, but here I come again to the 2% remarks Kolinda made a moment ago. Libya, it was NATO in Libya, and the European allies thought they could manage Libya on their own. They could not manage Libya on their own, because they needed air-to-air refueling capability. They needed American air defense. They needed everything the Europeans didn't have, and the Americans had, to the big frustration of Obama. So keep the Americans online and involved. Talk not about strategic autonomy in the defense sphere. On medicines, I can imagine that Europe should be autonomous strategically, but in the realm of defense, talk about Europe developing strategic power. Fine with me, but not autonomy. Autonomy is a word also in the English and American language. We are going to do things on our own, and we know that Europe cannot do things on their own.
Well, thank you, Samantha, for your questions. And let's move to Luis. He's got a question on the responsibility of Europe when it comes to the migrant crisis and the unrest on its southern flank. So Luis, go ahead, please.
Yes, so my question is, should Europe intervene in regional conflicts such as the ones in the Middle East to prevent these global issues from reaching their borders, specifically with migrants in Syria, Libya, and elsewhere?
Thank you very much, Luis. I do not see European intervention, quote unquote, in the military domain. Apart from one scenario I already mentioned, that's the Sahelian unrest, which of course is very much linked to uncontrolled and mass migration from Africa in this regard. What the European Union should do when we discuss migration is have an external agreement and an internal agreement. An internal agreement on finally putting an asylum seeker and a refugee and a labor migrant and an economic migrant all in the same basket. You'll never have a serious European Union migration policy in this regard. And the second agreement we need is with the countries of origin. So that we can have controlled labor migration, temporary migration, temporary labor migration. We need solidarity in Europe. And here again, there is a big internal problem in the European Union on internal solidarity on who is going to take whom. And you know, and I know that is a major challenge, and we have not seen the beginning of a solution in that regard. But I do not see, although Europe has a lot of instability around its borders, European Union borders, European borders, I do not see military intervention in the sense as we might see it in the Sahel, and we have seen it on previous occasions, but that was always be in the domain of NATO and together with the Americans. I mean, for the Dutch, and I only have to mention Srebrenica in the Balkans. For the Dutch, it is absolutely unthinkable to launch any or to be part of any military operation between either a major European nation, which either would be the UK or France, or the United States for that matter. Absolutely impossible and out of the question. So my answer to your question is I don't see that happen very quickly. No. And the problem is that the United States of America, of course, is to a certain extent withdrawing from the Middle East, giving their energy independence. And the question again is, in Kolinda's words, who is going to fill the vacuum there? I do not see the European Union or Europe do that in the short term.
And I'd like to conclude our discussion on that note. Operations out of area operations, Afghanistan, for instance, it's very close to my heart. I've learned to love that country deeply during my frequent visits to the country, and I believe that we were doing great work in Afghanistan. I just wonder whether we made a mistake in the first place. Of course, we should have never been involved in nation building. It's up for the people. But what about institution building to preserve the gains? And how do you see the future of NATO operations, in particular with the announcements of the previous and the current administration to pull out of Afghanistan? How do we preserve the gains? I will never forget the moment when I came to NATO and I was so enthusiastic about, making a difference in Afghanistan. And one of the aspects was, of course, about women. I think human rights was one of the reasons why we went in. It was just not the September 11 attacks and preventing Afghanistan from ever becoming a safe haven for Al-Qaeda or other terrorists again. And, when I talked about women, I was sort of rebuffed and unpleasantly surprised by, unfortunately, another female colleague at NATO saying, we're not there to fight for women in Afghanistan. And on the other hand, when during my frequent visits and speaking to commanders from Petraeus to Allen to Dunford to Nicholson and others, when we would ask women, what is the biggest gain that we achieved in Afghanistan apart from the transition to the Afghan National Security Forces, they would say us. We are the ones who embrace the values and the change that you wanted to embed in Afghanistan. So how do we ensure the future of Afghanistan? Again, pointing to what I said in the beginning, I don't think that many, in particular European countries, are aware of what will happen if things fall in Afghanistan and the millions of refugees that will come our way. But how do we ensure the future of NATO? So how would you conclude this discussion? What advice would you give to President Biden and European presidents and to all of us at NATO, how to carry NATO forward, to become, to think more strategically, not just in terms of ad hoc operations, to move well beyond crisis management and strengthen the analytical capability and the joint threat response mechanisms, and to really be the alliance fit for purpose beyond not just 2021, but beyond 2030.
That's a big one. On your remarks about women, I can only say amen. Let me start there. I even during my mandate, I traveled to Afghanistan with my wife, who is a French teacher. Kabul University has a French section I didn't know, and she gave some lectures there and was involved in women's affairs. On your general question, Kolinda, I think looking back at the operation in Afghanistan, my first remark would be that also then we did not entirely prevent every single nation looking at Afghanistan through a straw, focusing on its own province, on its own priorities. So the general political roof which you need for such an operation was from time to time not rain shower proof, to use that expression. My second remark is NATO is an alliance of democracies, and democracies are always out of breath because there are elections every 4 years or 5 years or whatever. We left too early, we left too soon. And my point now would be, but I know that Joe Biden, when he was vice president under Obama, already was very much in favor of a residual counterterrorism force when Obama was discussing the surge, as you will very well remember, Kolinda. I think that's the Americans should say. It's not a large force, as you know. And then inside the North Atlantic Alliance, and the Dutch still have people on the ground, and many other nations have people on the ground. I mean, now giving up completely, how are we going to look back to what happened in your days and my days at NATO, when we have 150,000 troops on the ground of 50 nations, 50 nations? So in NATO should be ready, and you ask about the future. to see that we keep our breath and that democracies can keep their breath and not after a certain period say, okay, guys, this was it. This is Afghanistan. It's far away. Girls will go to school and the women will be all right. No, the women will not be all right if I see developments now. Although we have in that regard, I think, achieved a lot. So this is one of the key elements when you praise yourself to be an alliance of values. This is one of the key debates we should have. And on Afghanistan, you and I know well, Kolinda, when the Americans leave, what will be left? The others will immediately follow suit, and we'll have an Afghanistan where the women might be brought back to square one, and that's a very bad square for them, for women.
Unfortunately, that would be a really bad legacy.
It would be.
So many lives invested into just coalition lives, but also Afghan lives. So I hope we do preserve the gains. But thank you, Jaap, for such an interesting conversation tonight. Thank you for your views and your perspectives. I hope to see you again soon in person next time. I would also like to thank my co-producers today, Samantha and Louis, for their help. And to all of you, thank you for watching us tonight. And please join us next week for our next seminar on the challenges of building social consensus and reform of education on Monday, the 12th of April at 4 p.m. Eastern Time here in the US, 2100 hours GMT. Thank you and have a good evening.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye now.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.